Hi, my name is Tom Keenan. I teach literature, media studies, and human rights at Bard. I've been at Bard for, I guess, 20 years now. I came to Bard to start a human rights program. Bard was the first college in the United States to offer a full freestanding BA in human rights, and we've been doing that for 2 decades now. Leon, nice to see you. I think from the background that you're in your office at the college.
I am, and I hope you're doing well and your family is doing well.
We're all as well as can be expected. Everybody's healthy. So I hope the same with you.
It is.
Good. So I thought we had talked about having a conversation around the theme of university as refuge, as a way of opening a broader discussion about the role of academic institutions in a discussion about human rights. But I thought we should maybe take that topic extremely literally to begin with, and in light of the current situation, and talk about how the college responded to the situation of students in the face of this. Many other institutions sent their kids packing rather peremptorily. Bard made a different decision and kept some dorms open for students who, for various reasons, couldn't go elsewhere or return home. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you came to that decision and how you understand more broadly kind of the trade-off between the university, the college, as a exemplar of rational scientific decision making and public health on the one hand, but also as a humanitarian institution with certain ethical commitments. How did you make your way through that dilemma?
Well, let me say before answering that it's a pleasure to talk with you. As you said, you came to build a human rights program, and your actual academic training and first career, in a way, was as a scholar of literature and as a theorist about how language and literature work in society. And people often think of a question such as human rights as being segmented into a question of politics or a question of a sociological question, or maybe a philosophical question. But
Or a legal one?
exactly right. And so it's interesting that you represent the best of what we try to do, which is to not to have a program or a faculty that's imitative of academic disciplines, but respond to a problem. And the problem is, how do we conceive the way we are the same with other people and therefore possibly entitled uh, that it is possible that we have a world in which people are view each other with a lens of a shared uh, ethical set of ethical obligations, a shared set of, especially in the world where we are conscious of the limits of our environment and the ability to live health well and properly within one space, which is the globe. That there are many angles on the question of broadly under the flag, if you will, of human rights. To your question, I would say that there are two factors. One, many institutions are just large corporations. You know, people say, should I go to a large place, a small place? And there are many pros and cons. But one of the things that characterizes a Bard, and Bard's not alone in that respect, is that by being relatively small, we don't have a huge swath of graduate students. We don't have um, postdocs in large numbers. We have postdocs, but not that many. And the whole community is around 2,000, physical community. We have 6,000 degree candidates around the world and in high schools around the country and so forth. But the college and graduate programs, but some in New York City even, but the college in Annandale is that there are about 2,000 students. So you can actually look at the numbers with a little bit more attention to the individual. And the decision was so that one, we were able to make the decision, and I imagine that somebody who is responsible for a place with 30,000 students, that suddenly becomes impossible. The second is that we're in a rural area and that we don't have high-rise dormitories, that have elevators, and so the relatively small size, scale, even of the buildings. But I think the most important question is the one you raised. I'm not sure it was a trade-off between a sense of refuge with any health risk. In fact, we have a lot of international students. Almost 20% of our enrollment comes from abroad. And the real question was, it's safe for them to leave. Even in the United States, we're 100 miles north of New York, more or less. And there are some New Yorkers who elected to stay. And then there are people who are on very, very large scholarships who don't really have, are from not privileged economic backgrounds. And, we think of going back home as a kind out of some film about Little Women, a big house, with many rooms, and take a few extra people in. No, there are people who have younger siblings, a single parent, where the conditions at home are, even in health terms, more challenging and also economically not feasible. And some people who couldn't afford to go back. So we have about 300 students living on campus. We normally have about 1,500 students living on campus. So, yeah, we offer them the possibility, and some of the international students, we may have to provide them shelter over the summer before the next semester begins. So, I think that's less of a issue of refuge, more than a tradition of looking at the individual, not looking at groups. How many X students do we have? How many Y students do we have? How many from Michigan? And how many from Korea? And how many? In other words, grouping students by either identity or category, but actually, in a very old-fashioned Oxbridge way, seeing them as individuals.
Yeah. Well, I've been talking to a few students this week in my classes who have remained on campus, and I think they're grateful to be able to be there and doing their work as best they can, as everyone is trying. I think I'll take up what you said about the human rights program at Bard, which is, in addition to being the first freestanding one in the country, I think it's also rather unusual. As you say, historically, most academic discussions of human rights have taken place in legal or policy contexts, and we made the decision at once to try to take human rights seriously as an intellectual question, not just as a toolkit for addressing wrongs in the world, but to think about it from the perspective of the history of ideas, from the perspective of a wide range of disciplines. So the faculty members in the program come from anthropology, they come from art history. As you say, I'm a wayward literary scholar. We did finally hire someone with legal competence ultimately in the program. But it's remained a very broad tent of people coming from different academic backgrounds, but kind of united around a set of questions about human rights.
Don't you have a lot of double majors?
We have about half of the majors every year are jointly with other programs. So, and many in the arts. Actually, we have a couple. This year, we have a dance and human rights major. We have film and human rights majors, photo and human rights majors, and then maybe the more predictable ones like anthropology and politics and literature.
I think if many people ask, parents and people looking at the college, uh, does human rights have a particular point of view? I mean, is it, when you say human rights, that some people who are old enough will remember Jimmy Carter, or the word human rights was used by Ronald Reagan during the '80s in the run up to the
Yeah.
end of the Cold War. That and I remember when the proposal was made, when you and I first met, and the faculty discussed and debated the issue of human rights. What I thought, and I'm not sure, we've never had this conversation. My gamble was that, just as you said, it was a way of framing a very set of important questions about um, who I am and how I relate to my neighbor, close and far. I mean, as simple as that. And rather, it's a you might say human rights question mark. In other words, that's as opposed to being a school of indoctrination about a set of I imagine the UN. Doesn't the UN have a Declaration of Human Rights? It does have such a
They
thing.
do,
Yeah,
yes.
that's right. And I mean, is there debate about its content, or is there a consensus that its content is right, complete? You follow what I'm asking?
There is a great deal of debate, and the content is sometimes even incoherent internally. So, yeah. No, when we were starting the program, our analogy may seem kind of perverse, was to a department of religion. In the religion department at Bard, we're not teaching students how to be Protestants or Jews. We're teaching them to study a set of ideas and practices and traditions and figures and narratives and images. And we approached the question of human rights in a somewhat similar way. It can't only be that, though, and that was the other commitment we made, was that this was not an ivory tower study of human rights where everybody was just going to write treatises on the profound questions. We also wanted to bring into the classroom people with real world experience in doing this thing that is called human rights out there, and to make it possible for the students to get out into the world as well. So we've always tried to create an academic environment in which there's a kind of cross pollination, and we're able to ask critical and sometimes very dissident questions about human rights from the academic perspective, but we're always testing that against encounters with people for whom this is serious business, maybe life and death business from the front line. So
Yes. Well, as you know, and because you're involved in it, you're running a human rights program um, in an academic setting involving theoretical questions and what you call ivory tower questions. I've never seen an ivory tower, by the way. It's one of the metaphors or images of higher education which has always baffled me. I always sort of think, what are they talking about? I mean, I've been in many universities. I'm always looking for the ivory tower. In any event, I'm sure there is a literary reference which I don't simply know, but the uh, you're also running it in the context of an institution that has the largest prison education program in the country, and
yeah,
the leading one, of which there was a 4-hour documentary made called College Behind Bars, which uh, people in their quarantines can look at with leisure, in leisure. But and that's a population. The prison population is one where uh, people have, under the laws and through due process, been forfeited of some things that we consider their human rights.
yeah.
Uh, but do you ever encounter students who join the program who have really dissident political views and or views on the subject? I mean, is there a lot of controversy within the community of people who study this field at Bard? And is that and how is that controversy conducted? I'm not suggesting you have a student who wants perversely to defend the practice of slavery. I would think that that's probably an unlikely event.
That's off the table
That's
generally.
why
Yeah.
that's off the. I would thank God, but I mean, is there? I mean, you know what I'm driving at. Is there somebody? I'm a student and I'm coming from a certain background, and I see the word human rights and I associate it with a certain point of view, and I have some differing point of views about things like free expression,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, free speech?
we have those. So I teach a class on freedom of expression, which, in a kind of a strict legal way, seems pretty unequivocal. There's a First Amendment. It says anything goes, but it turns out that other things are actually possible, and there are debates about limits on free expression, and that's actually we try to construct a situation in the classroom which is sort of committed to the notion that we can argue about everything, including arguing, including freedom of expression and its potential limits. So it's a great example there. I'll also tell since you brought up slavery. I recall a few years ago we had a colleague who's no longer at Bard who taught on the history of colonialism, and was very interested in the way in which a number of colonial enslavement enterprises had actually been legitimized under the banner of humanitarianism and humanization. And so it turns out that there's a fascinating debate that emerged in those classes about the complicity between something like the intellectual ancestor of human rights talk today and one of the gravest violations of human rights that anyone can imagine. So we're trying to put those issues in front of the students.
Yeah, you're being a literary scholar. You're also looking at the way language obviously functions. Do you? Is the human rights program a place a student can study what we might call closed societies? In other words, societies that are repressive from our point of view, control media, control
Sure.
speech, movement, are discriminatory between different groups, where there's no separation of, let's say, religion and state. I mean, do you look at the historical or even current circumstance of different kinds of, because there are organizations like Human Rights Watch, aren't they not?
Yes.
And places that look at this question. Do you study either historically or in current terms the consequences, if you will, of what a social order looks like that doesn't have an active conversation or process by which the issue of human rights or fundamental rights of every human being are considered?
Yeah, our students have worked. I mean, the place where you see the most sustained engagement with questions like that is in the senior project. So every year we have a number of projects that are looking at, what, for lack of a better term, you could call dictatorships or authoritarian regimes, closed societies. We've had great projects on the history of Latin American dictatorships, often in co-advised with colleagues in Spanish or Latin American studies. We've had a number of great projects, interestingly, about Russia, and about, I remember a great project about Chechnya, where the student actually tried to go at it from a slightly sideways angle, and rather than writing a Human Rights Watch report on uh, atrocities in Chechnya, got interested in one of the few organizations in Russia which had actually tried to play an active role in contesting the war in Chechnya, which was an organization of the Mothers of Soldiers. And so she wrote a really detailed exploration of how this dissident group came from the margins and managed to harness the power of being mothers to wage I mean, they didn't stop the war in Chechnya, but they put it in question in a serious way. So, yeah, that's
Let me ask you a question. Since I know you have a child in college, I think your daughter is finishing her first year in college, and I've had children who have been in college, not in this too far distant past. So, if I were a parent of a student and a new student or a current student and said, "Mom, Dad, I'm going to major in human rights," and I'm just an ordinary person. Why not just biology or English or history? And then, in order to quarrel with my children, I would say, So what do you think you're going to do with a undergraduate degree in human rights? Why not go to pharmacy school? You think I'm going to be able to support you for the rest of my life? What? So, can you tell me a little bit about? There must be some track record, some
Yeah.
evidence of what your graduates, what kind of things do they go? I mean, in music, which is my field, right? We have people who are now molecular biologists. You know? We have people who are musicians, but we have people who are molecular biologists. We have people who are lawyers. We have a corporate lawyer on the West Coast. He went to Harvard Law School and still plays the French horn. But the what I'm saying is that so we have every possible, we some musicians actually, I would guess over the long period of time, most of our graduates end up they don't even conservatory they don't end up in music. So what about your the people who've ended up doing their senior projects in human rights?
Yeah. They go to an amazing array of places. We just had a little session. My junior seminar every year meets with some alumni of the human rights program. So we did that last week, actually. So we had 7 alumni who are, I think, in a way, exemplary of what our students have done. Some are working in the nonprofit sector, in NGOs, in human rights organizations. One worked at Human Rights Watch and went on to become the development director for another major human rights organization. We have one. We have one who worked as a housing rights organizer in Harlem for a couple of years, and then got a job at the ACLU, and is now going on to law school. So law school is a destination for a number of students, not usually immediately after college, but ultimately. We had a number of students in the past few years who've gone on to social work degrees as well after being a human rights major. But we have students who are in journalism. We have a number who've gotten PhDs and in subjects which were not obviously related to human rights. Art history PhD is one who comes to mind.
So
So
if I can ask you a little bit about the future. So we're in the midst of a pandemic, right? And there are people who have argued that health is a human right. Well, I'm born into the world, and I didn't choose my parents. I didn't choose their region, their social economic circumstances. Um, and let's say here in the United States, you think that there is going to be a shift of interest? You think that human rights is a pathway for people who want to go into the health profession, to medical school, into even epidemiology, which I think will get, Anthony Fauci, who was an honorary degree recipient at Bard many years ago, and is also I think he was a commencement speaker in the 90s, and for his work in the AIDS epidemic. The question is whether a human rights undergraduate degree is a prelude for law, you mentioned, which is obvious. Um, for medicine, and if I hazard the possibility for business.
yes. So again, our program is not training people, as you said, in a doctrine. It's a opportunity to ask critical questions about the world and about various proposals for making the world a better place. And I think that's a valuable training for anybody, no matter what they do. I think if we had more people with human rights degrees in business, the world would be better. Doctors, we have had a number of students who graduated from Bard with human rights degrees who went on to medical school. I ran into one at a reunion a few years ago who had become a community doctor in Philadelphia, actually, after his path out of Bard. So um, I'm convinced, as you say, that there will be many more of these, because obviously the pandemic is among all the other things that it is a human rights issue. It's clear that it exaggerates inequality. It preys on vulnerable populations. It makes exclusion and repression easier. And we've seen now too many instances of people who have acted as kind of whistleblowers, scientists, doctors, and so on, about the pandemic being the targets themselves of government repression. So I think thinking about the pandemic as a human rights question is important. And I think we'll be doing that. So next year, as part of the first year experience for our students, we've created a number of kind of big idea courses, and one of them will be on epidemics in society, led by Helen Epstein, who's a human rights faculty member and a distinguished analyst of the human rights dimensions of health emergencies all over the world.
She's in the public health area. That's her expertise.
Yeah.
But let me ask you: do you think? Let's turn it a little more to a political prognostication. Do you think the experience in the United States with the pandemic will change what has become a stalled and stale debate on whether there should be a national health insurance? Do you think that this will pandemic experience will change the calculation of our fellow citizens on the question that my health is not a consumer item that I can buy and protect? I can't go to the store and buy my product and put it in my refrigerator, and it's my property. That the health of the poorest anonymous person living in the society that I share the space with, that person's health is in my interest to protect. In other words, it's a reciprocal situation. I can't segregate.
Your health is my health these days.
That's right. Your health is my health. Therefore, it seems logical, which most other nations have come to the conclusion, Canada, England, Greece, which looks like it has a very good track record, if you can believe what you read in the New York Times, in dealing with the pandemic. All European nations have some kind of national system of delivering some baseline quality health. We don't. And we seem, since Harry Truman, we have been unable to come to an agreement about this, as if it were a private good, if you will, a consumer good. Do you think that the coronavirus experience and the reaction to the chaos and unpreparedness and the attempt to politically exploit it by all politicians will have an impact on the way we view health in relationship to our fellow citizens?
Well, we can certainly hope. I'm not a predictor, but it feels like the idea that the state of the American health system and health insurance system has played a role in the fact that so many people have died, and that the system felt so unprepared for this. That seems to be a leading takeaway of where we are right now. So I think, obviously it's a political question, and it depends on political will and leadership. I don't know how optimistic I would be about that, but I certainly think that from the ground up, there's an awareness now that we do need to be a bit more active on the question of health as a civil right or a human right here.
Yeah. We predict, and that will affect the human rights program. I'm curious what you think. We predict an increased respect and interest in the study of science.
Yeah.
No, I think that we've been through a period of time where people, have partly inspired by the literary theorists that you know so well, that have sort of raised very interesting and challenging questions about how much do we know and the nature of knowledge and science and so forth and so on. But now it seems that that there is such a thing as science, and there is a distinction between fiction and fantasy, there is fake news, whether it is what will kill the virus and whether you should ingest it or not. I mean, there is that there are rules of evidence and there are protocols that are not simply conspiracies
Yeah.
to show that now is calling for a vaccine, and we have just been through a period of several years of battling people who don't believe in vaccines. So I'm curious what you think the intellectual, if you will, prejudices of people coming into college and seeking to use education as a guide for their own lives. I suspect there'll be a shift of interest and prestige to the study of science. And interesting how human rights would connect to that.
I agree with you. So I would say among incoming students, and no doubt more than ever, there's a complicated relation to questions about truth and knowledge. On the one hand, there's a good critical skepticism about official narratives and stories that governments tell us. I think that's healthy, to use a bad metaphor, as a general rule. And there's a lot of interest in figuring out what the truth is. If you're skeptical about what the government is telling you, then you might want to have some tools for learning how to figure it out yourself. And I think we see more and more of that. I think one thing that the pandemic is going to do is maybe deprive people of the luxury of being only critical about the official stories, and obligate sort of a new mode of inquiry and investigation. And I think that's something that we've been trying to work on in the Human Rights Program now for a while, is kind of balancing the truth claiming with critical debunking of official stories.
You know that in the last couple of years, before the pandemic wiped out all other journalistic conversation, you know, there was a lot of journalistic interest on the question of do people who disagree, are they able to debate on a college campus? You've been through this. We've all
Yeah.
been through this. So it was, at Middlebury, Charles Murray, or um, in our own institution, we had a controversy that stemmed out of a conference at the Hannah Arendt Center, and where people who held deeply rooted convictions. Um, there's no way language was possible um, to persuade the other person to see the other person's point of view,
Hmm.
and so we were saying the idea that, which I think is very sensible. So skepticism is a good thing. I mean, I think skepticism is a healthy first gambit, if you will.
Hmm.
But then the question is turning it around. What can you? Where is there solid ground you can stand on? But people believe that they come in. That's the way people have talked about it in the journal. They come in with solid ground already. We have first year students come in and they're as they always did. In a previous generation, people came with religious beliefs, and then
Right.
they got into a class and they began to read books which tried to argue that the idea of a divine presence is at best a kind of psychological crutch, and there's no rational evidence. And you might have had followers of St. Thomas Aquinas, in the faculty, saying that there's a way around this, or followers of Pascal who said we don't have to reconcile it, just live with it, believe in God, and then also pursue your science. I mean, the people who tried to get around the issue, but the conflict between believers, different kind of beliefs, the feeling was you came to college to test your beliefs. And the question is whether the coronavirus will change what has been sort of the pattern in which people retreat and stay inside the comfort zone of their own beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
And is the human rights program a place where you can draw people out of that comfort zone? And does science provide any kind of common ground, where people will say, I was wrong. I thought I could get coronavirus by playing baseball. Now it turns out that the baseball is not a vector of the disease. And, or I can't get it by, that the transmission system, I had some belief about the transmission system, or I thought that a certain kind of soap product will destroy it when in fact it isn't true. Is it possible to convince someone who is so emotionally committed to the idea that that in fact they'll apply conspiracy theories to your showing evidence of controlled studies that show that Smith's soap doesn't kill the virus? That actually something is much more complicated than that, and you can't use a vaccine for uh,
Right.
one cure for one disease and just transport it to the other, and it will work. One bug is as good as any other bug. How does the human teaching of human rights for you, or literature, or the humanities, or now this with this coronavirus, will this give us a better repertoire? Because I believe that I'm convincible that I'm wrong.
Yeah.
I believe you can make an argument to me, not because I'm spineless, I won't stand up for my beliefs, but you might convince me that my belief is wrong, or that I should reconsider it, or
Yeah.
that you're right.
I agree completely. I'm not worried that our students are uh, uh, dogmatic, ideological, unchangeable of mind. I see students over 4 years at Bard going through so many enormous intellectual, emotional, political transformations, often in the course of one semester or one class. So I have to say I'm super optimistic on that and on the way in which kind of a commitment to argument and offering reasons, and respecting the person on the other side. You don't have to agree with them. You don't even have to, quote unquote, put yourself in their shoes. But you need to take the objection they're making to your position seriously and argue back. That seems like an ethos that's completely alive in our classrooms. I see it. I teach a class on evidence, evidence in human rights cases, which begins in a kind of soft way with questions about narrative and testimony, and builds toward the end to a look at human rights forensics, at data analysis, and so on. And Bard students, a number of them, often tell you that they're a little bit allergic to math or to science. Not all of them, but some of them. And you'd be surprised what they're able to say about the claims made with data and about forensic work and so on by the end of it. So I don't know. I don't want to be too self-congratulatory about the institution, but I think there's a pretty solid shared commitment there to questioning the other and yourself.
I think what the pandemic will reduce the allergy to science and
I
mathematics
agree with you.
among our undergraduates, which is great. And we've always had a strong science cohort in the undergraduate student population, but as in many cases, there's often a segregation between
Yeah.
those that go into the hard sciences and those that go into the humanities.
And at Bard, definitely our bridge is precisely and has been now for many years through public health, which has so many overlaps to human rights talk. So the students who we have who want to do both are majoring in biology and human rights, oftentimes in psychology and human rights, and they're good undergraduate scientists with training in human rights as well.
Which is great. And we have epidemiologists on our faculty as well, who are interested in this cross section, and the environmental questions, the environmental issue that was very prominent before the coronavirus hit in the minds of an incoming generation of students, raises a whole host of human rights questions.
Environment and food. There's
Food. Why food?
so much interest among our students in food production, in the science of food, in access to food, in hunger. People are thinking about food, in a sense, as a kind of human rights question of the 21st century. We now have increasingly students every year who are writing senior projects on kind of politics of food issues.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the availability of clean water and proper nutrition,
or questions about the corporatization of food production, big agriculture, or the politics of organic farming, and so on.
Is there and how does that how does those environmental concerns, environmental commitment, uh, if some corporate person were to say, the mass production of food or the preservation of food, canned food, which actually seem to have flown off the shelves in the pandemic, that I would prefer, grass-fed, unpacked, milk, so all those niceties seem to favor the preservatives because people have this feeling that there would be nothing to eat. So suddenly, I read somewhere that Chef Boyardee cans took a spike in sales.
Extreme situations call for extreme measures. Yeah.
Right. So how this interest in food extends to some connection to human rights as understanding the preservation of the planet for future generations? Is that the underlying idea?
Yeah, that's one. I think it connects more broadly to the interest our students have had in the environment for many years now. But there are different forms of environmental commitment, and when human rights questions get plugged in to a passion for protecting the environment, the way you do it can change a little bit when you start thinking in terms of environmental justice, connecting nature and the people who live in nature to one another. Then you might come away with a somewhat different program for your environmental or your food activism when it's tempered or changed by a discussion about equality, about rights, about justice, and so on. So I think our students are really concerned not just about environment, but about environmental justice. Not just about food, but about food justice.
So let me shift the conversation for a moment, because one of the distinctive parts I feel about the institution is its international linkages. So if you could talk a little bit about how, as a teacher, not even in the human rights program, the sort of network that Bard has of international relations and the presence of students from abroad influences. In other words, there's a human rights discussion, which is an American discussion, right? But we're less provincial than that.
Indeed.
And I wonder how that influences the climate of conversation on the campus.
Yeah. I recall a few years ago, I was teaching my freedom of expression class, and there were a couple of women from, I forget, maybe from Smolny in St. Petersburg or another international Bard campus, who walked into to this group of American First Amendment dogmatists and completely transformed our conversation over the course of the year from the perspective of traditions, legal and political traditions, in which not everything goes, in which you can't read Mein Kampf in Germany, and so on. So that has always been a very valuable piece of the BARD experience for me, is students from our network campuses in my classrooms. But I also, I human rights particularly is a curricular strand that connects a lot of the campuses. They don't all have, let's say, anthropology programs or biology programs, but they do. Bishkek, St. Petersburg, Berlin, Al-Quds all have thriving human rights programs, and we have very vibrant exchanges between faculty and students. We team teach classes. We were Zooming before anyone knew about Zoom with our colleagues in human rights classes in the other campuses. So I think it really changes the conversation completely to have. Last year, I was teaching a course on human rights advocacy with a colleague at Bard College Berlin, and in her classroom are a number of Syrian refugee students for whom human rights advocacy is not either a wish or an abstraction, but a reality of their lives. And it makes it very different.
So as we come to a close in the conversation, how do you react to a very common, often never thought through objection? But it's an objection you hear every once in a while, that human rights is a Western conceit. Right? It's a kind of liberal version of colonialism or imperialism, and the developed world. And let's say you had a student who came in from a traditional society in which the value system and traditions and political group were different, and that what gives us the right to either criticize, intervene, or in some cases impose. Human rights is often invoked as a reason for military intervention. Right? We're protecting the human rights of a minority in a particular place. People, the Syrian situation is a good example of failure on all sides in the world to stem what I would view as a humanitarian catastrophe. But how does one deal with the a greater divide in cultural, which we find in our classrooms because we have students from all over the world? How does one deal with that in a classroom?
I think we need to be frank about the fact that indeed a lot of human rights talk and thinking did emerge in the West. Not only, but a lot of it. So we shouldn't try to pretend that, since time immemorial, in many different languages, people have been speaking about human rights and blah, blah, blah. But be honest about the fact that this has been primarily a Western creation. But the vocabulary and the ethical commitments, which are varied and which are sometimes contradictory, do now have a global existence. And the proof of the interest is in the uptake from the ground all over the world. Again, not in any uniform way. People mean by human rights very different things in very different places and different times. But the fact is that it is a kind of a shared vocabulary now in which people can negotiate with each other.
No, but let me push back a little bit. So we're all locked up in our homes, and I finally got to watch this Netflix series called Unorthodox. I don't know whether you've seen it.
I have not.
I recommend it. It's a Netflix film based on a book, I think from 2012, by a woman who autobiographically describes her emergence from the Hasidic community in Brooklyn, and the way this is portrayed in the film, I'm no film critic, so I watched the film really out of curiosity about how this was all portrayed. But the reason I bring it up is because the question of gender. So here, this is a person who comes from a community. Now, she's a dissident in that community, but
Mm-hmm.
there are large groups of religious communities uh, out of the Abrahamic tradition. They range from evangelical Christian to forms of Jewish orthodoxy to Islamic fundamentalism of various kinds, in which the role status of women is absolutely sanctified, literally sanctified by tradition and by the authority of the divine as subordinate uh, in big ways and very small ways, but in a continuous way. In this case, this woman described where she was not permitted to study the piano, she was not permitted to become really educated. And this was by community consent, by popular demand. So, who are we uh, if you had someone who came out of those kinds of traditions? How would one approach their claim, my God and my faith? I don't feel subordinate. I'm only supposed to bear children. I can't do this. I have to be separated from. I do all kinds of things. I can't own property. I have no legal status. Um, but I defend it. I'm not a caricature of an older generation person. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
young, perfectly healthy person, age 20.
The short answer is that we do it by listening to the people in the community who are already raising questions themselves, like the woman you're describing, the dissident. Um, the longer answer is it's a kind of insoluble problem. On the one hand, human rights is a discourse of absolutes. There's some things that you just are not acceptable to do to other human beings, like torture them or murder them without charge or whatever. But so their human rights is at once a discourse of absolutes, and on the other hand, a discourse of respecting the autonomy and the independence of all individuals. And we can never resolve this contradiction. Finally, um, uh, and at some points, one just decides one way or the other, or context decides one way or the other. But I think that those extreme situations are rare, and generally speaking, there are communities are not monolithic, and they produce internal tensions, and there is an opening for others to participate as allies, as advocates, and so on. And I think that's the bulk of human rights work.
But we all, the interesting thing is, I appreciate your pointing out that there are some commitments one simply has to confess to. And a belief in gender equity is something we confess to. That we're very sympathetic, empathetic. We'd like to accommodate, but there are some absolutes having to do with um, wherever they came from, whatever their origins are. But that belief doesn't require intolerance.
Right.
It doesn't require, as you say, lack of empathy, without necessarily without feigning justification.
Right.
Anyway, I I I'm enjoying this conversation, and one thing that
Me too.
viewers can watch is that um, Tom is a wonderful teacher, in part because he has a warmth and a natural sense of humor, and his capacity to laugh and see the ironic, I think, may come from his literary. The many social scientists are humorless, but very few students of literature can afford to be humorless. And because without satire and irony, where would literature be? But
It's
it
true.
is.
It's also a very good feature in a college president, let me just say.
Oh yes, no, life without a sense of humor would be totally intolerable, and a sense of irony. But uh, I, um, I want to say that we hope that we are all able to get together in real time, in real space in the fall, and that students who are returning or students who are going to be entering as first year students, one of the real gems is the human rights program, and I'm glad we had a chance to talk about the possibilities of connecting it to everything from the study of science and to the study of the arts.
Yes, me too. It's really nice to talk with you about all of this.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And you stay safe, Tom.
Okay, you too.
Okay. Bye
Okay,
bye.
bye bye.